So you should be getting your official notice, and we are on the record now. Grace is with us now. Good. Hello there. And in some of the classes, my understanding is that students check in by saying hello in the chat, and that way there's a record of who actually showed up. I haven't done that. I just sort of do a with only 15 of you, it's not all that hard to keep track of sort of in a holistic way who's here. Good. We have Chandini and Isabel. So we are slowly building up strength. Good. And Claire now. Excellent. All right. So I was telling the others that I logged on at 11:07 and was all by myself. There was no one here, and I was especially concerned, particularly since Friday was everything worked out fine on Friday, but there were some mishaps involving which room one should be in. I was in well, not only the lecture, but then a student was giving a presentation right after that I had to go to, and then I had another discussion group that I go to, and then my afternoon class, and then my office hour. So it was, but there were in at least 3 of the classes or 3 of the gatherings, there was confusion about which link to use, because Friday was not a typical day, being considered a Wednesday by university, but not necessarily by Zoom. So it was made for a bit of confusion. But we survived. Jinyi, you're with us now. Good. So, okay. So I think we have our critical mass. So let me start by asking you what you thought of the lecture. Those of you who were able to be there or watch it afterwards. Any reactions to it? I did read your papers, so I was glad to see that you had given it some thought, and I think mostly it turned out well, and it was pitched at the right level, I thought, and certainly contained interesting material. I don't know. Anyone have any reactions they want to share with us?
For me, it was quite interesting because I didn't know that in Cappadocia there was a different language, and especially that type with a huge influence from Greek. Because I know in Turkey there is this mixture sometimes, yeah, due to the history, but yeah, this dialect in Cappadocia, it's quite amazing actually. Well, and this finding to find the speakers in there.
Oh yeah, Mark once told me that he had been reading texts in Cappadocian for many years, because in that work by that man Dawkins that he referred to, but he said that that these words that were just words on a page for him, when the first time he met one of these speakers and heard them say something, he said it was like walking back in time. He said it was just an incredible feeling. This language, which had only existed in his head, really, because he would read it and it would be in it, he would pronounce it as he was reading it, but to actually hear someone else say something, he said it was a remarkable experience.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Imagine.
Good. Okay. Well, great. I'm glad it was a good experience. Mark enjoyed it, and he said that he was pleased that the questions that you could see from that there was a lot of interest. That's often an index of how well you're able to convey your ideas, if it sparks some discussion and interest. So that I was glad to see that, and Mark considered the experience to be very positive. So I appreciate all of you for your being there and augmenting the audience somewhat, and I'm glad that it was beneficial to you as well.
Here in Brazil, Cappadocia is very famous because we had a soap opera which showed lots of places in Cappadocia.
Really?
And
Huh.
so, and the Brazilian tourism in there, yeah, raised a lot. And
Yeah.
then, I had a tourist guide from there here, because he wanted to learn Portuguese, because he said there are lots of Brazilians in there visiting Cappadocia.
Amazing.
Because of this soap opera at that time.
Oh, I
But
see.
till now, they carry on. Yeah, they
Yeah.
continue
I wonder if Mark knows
going in
about that.
there.
I'll have to mention that to him. It's a great
Yeah.
tourist site now, or at least, pre-pandemic and hopefully post-pandemic, because of these curious rock formations that he had in his background. And now there are the sky on a typical day is filled with hot air balloons, because one of the ways of seeing these remarkable geological formations is by going over them in the balloons. So I've
Yeah.
been there twice myself, and before one of them once, I guess 45 years ago or so, and before there was a big tourist boom there. But it's a really interesting part of the world. Very, very interesting.
I imagine.
Good.
Unique, probably unique,
It
right?
is in its own way. Yes, definitely. Great. Okay. Well, good. I'm glad it was a good experience for everyone. It took a lot of organization, but it all worked, and that's good. So, just by way of announcements, I posted a homework assignment today that will be due on Wednesday. It's a brief, short one that you should be able to do within 30 minutes. And I don't want, if you can't, spend just 30 minutes on it and no more than that, and we'll see how far you get. It deals with some of the material that we dealt with, that we talked about in class last time, and that we will last Monday, and that we'll take up again today. So if there are no questions about anything, I will. I don't see any questions. So let me share my screen, and we will start with. Here we go. So last time we were talking about analogy. You remember, moving into a different realm of language change, dealing more with what we call morphological change, the change in the forms of words. And the definition that we gave for analogy was a change in one form induced by another related forms. And so it involves this notion of likening. So it's like metaphor in certain respects, metaphor being sort of semantic linkages among words. And what we deal with here in analogy is formal, that is morphological connections among words. So it's a kind of morphological assimilation. And the examples that we saw involving forms that are related to one another by being part of the same paradigm was the main type that we looked at. Though today we will look at other kinds of analogical developments, all of which, as I say here, typically involve a linkage between or among forms and a move towards greater similarity. That's why we can think of it as a formal or morphological assimilation, and also a kind of conceptual assimilation, in that the two forms that have some relationship to one another end up looking alike, looking more similar. The case in point was the older Latin paradigm with S in the nominative and R in the possessor and object case, turning into a later paradigm where there was R throughout the paradigm. So honos changed to honor. And we're able to say definitively that it's not a sound change of S to R, because the S remains in many words like mos, genus, and many others. So here I don't think I said this explicitly, But what property of sound change are we drawing on here in saying that this is not a sound change, that this has to be a different kind of change? What characteristic property of sound change allows us to say that? Anyone?
Regularity of sound change.
Yes, regularity of sound change, exactly. Yeah. And so had you, even if you didn't know the answer, as I said many times, that's the answer that I'm fishing for. And how so? Well, if sound change is regular, and if we find that this change of S to R in honos to honor is not regular because it doesn't occur in most, notice the same long O before the S, in case you're thinking that it might be some kind of phonetically conditioned, phonetic conditioning. Genus shows the S remaining. So it's not a matter of a sound change, and therefore we have to look to some other reason for this development from honos to honor, and analogy is what has been invoked. So it involves a sort of recognizing the similarity amongst these forms, honos and honor. And I mentioned this, the term that's sometimes used for this is leveling. So it's as if there's an anomaly within the paradigm at this stage, and it gets leveled out or smoothed out to give us a more uniform paradigm, a more uniform look to the paradigm. Yeah, so we'll come back to this. And then we looked at a couple other examples that the same kind of reasoning involved in this Greek example, but there was and notice the same kind of evidence can be brought to light here to tell us that it's not a sound change of M to N between vowels, because this sequence remains in many words. There's another reason why we might not think of this as a sound change. Can anyone look at what would be involved here and see it based on what we know about sound change, what we spent weeks and weeks and weeks talking about? Is there anything about this particular change that would be, let's say, suspicious as if we wanted to call it a sound change? Anyone have any thoughts about that? What would be the motivating factor if it were a sound change? What motivates sound change?
The phonetic features
Right.
surrounding.
Exactly. Thank you. Was that Jinyi? Yeah. The phonetic features of the phonetic environment. And is this a phonetic environment in which you can motivate a change from M to N simply between vowels? Do you want to continue with that, Jinyi?
There's no reason for
Exactly.
the vowels to trigger this change.
Exactly. There's nothing about the being a vowel per se that would drive an M, a labial M, in the direction of an N. So on the on the grounds of phonetic motivation, it's hard to see why this would be a sound change. What this means then is that there can be, and this will sound a bit anomalous, but let me put it here. There can be, oops, I will add it in red. Red is my favorite color. There we go. We can have change in sounds for instance, M to N in the word for one, or S to R in the word for honor. So there can be a change in sound, a change in the way a word is pronounced. That is not a sound change. Because we've been using sound change as a technical term for a particular kind of change in the sounds of the language as realized in particular words, in particular environments. So, I will sometimes, I think I mentioned that it's therefore important for us to draw a distinction between what I call sound change proper or sound change in a strict sense, or even sound change in a neo-grammarian sense. I've told you about the neo-grammarians and their this 19th century school of linguists who really pushed ahead and pushed forward this idea of sound change as regular. So sound change in a neo-grammarian sense, all of which is not equal to or is a subtype. Let's say this. All as a subtype of change in sound. So it sounds a bit anomalous. It seems like a contradiction. There's a change in sound that is not a sound change. But if we think of sound change as a technical term, so sound change as a technical term, not some sort of common sense idea that the sounds are different, but a technical term that phonetically driven regular, a phonetically driven event that affects all candidate forms in the same way, hence regularity. That's the important distinction that we need to make. So we can have a change in sound, the word for one becoming in the genitive from hemos to henos. So there's a change in the sound of that word, but it's not a sound change proper. It's not a sound change in the strict technical sense that we've been using it here. That's an important distinction that I'd like you to keep in mind. And then we ended last time with this different directionality of leveling. In the case of honos, it was the nominative case that followed the pattern of the others and changed to honor. We could wonder if it's a matter of the most prevalent form. So honor was more prevalent in the paradigm. In fact, the honos was restricted just to the nominative case. But that doesn't work here in the Greek case, where the N of the nominative is what is generalized throughout the paradigm. So it might be a matter of what form is grammatically basic. If we think of the nominative as more basic than the accusative or the genitive case, or the frequency within the paradigm, or maybe the frequency of the word as it's used, as opposed to the frequency of the form of the word in this sort of grammatical context of the paradigm, or something else, or maybe all of the above, and all of those could play a role, but in different ways. So it's still an open question, and not something that we can answer here, but it's an important question to keep in mind. So moving in the direction of something new, going beyond what we did last Monday, another open question is what motivates the analogical leveling in a case like this with hen, hem, or honos and honor. What motivates the where are we? What motivates the leveling? Why does the change take place at all? We can refer here to something that's been called the semiotic principle. Semiotic has to do with meaning in a very general sense, like the seam of or the SEM of semantics. And a semiotic principle that's been proposed for language is that ideally, in the ideal case, one form should be associated with one meaning. That is, there should be a one-to-one relationship between the form and the meaning. And this would be the ideal situation. And this is often sort of put into a slogan as one form to one meaning. If we adopt that semiotic principle, one form to one meaning, how is it at work in in the leveling cases that we've seen? How is it at work, for instance, in this Greek case of hen, hemos becoming hen, henos, heni? If the ideal is to have one form to one meaning, what's the situation that we have in this at this stage, with hen in the nominative but hem in the genitive and dative? How many forms are there to the meaning of one?
There are two different forms.
Yeah, clearly two different forms, hen and hem. And at this stage, after the leveling, what is the what's the form to meaning count, so to speak? How many forms, how many meanings? Obviously. What is it? Someone tell me. Someone put me out of my misery.
Just one.
Yeah, one. Exactly. So at this stage, before the leveling, we're less than ideal because there are two forms to one meaning, hen and hem, and the same, and just a single meaning of one. At this stage, there's a single form, hen, and a single meaning. So the semiotic principle seems to be behind the scenes, sort of, or can be taken as behind the scenes, acting on the guiding the development. One form to one meaning. Now, just as an aside, how reasonable is this as an ideal for one form to one meaning? Can you think of any counterexamples to this? And why do we talk about it just as an ideal and not as an actual hard constraint about human language? What kinds of are there any phenomena in human language that are counter examples to this notion of one form to one meaning?
We have synonyms all the time.
Right. So they're synonyms. There we have two forms and one meaning. So car and automobile are basically the same in terms of their real world referent. And therefore we have two different forms and one meaning. And are there other kinds of examples? And synonyms are all over the place, right? There's a lot of synonymy. There are people who claim that there's no such thing as absolute synonymy, so that car and automobile are not completely interchangeable, but they're very close, very close. And therefore, the semiotic principle is maybe sort of justified, but sort of not, because based on words like car and automobile, or car and auto, or the like, or mobile and cell phone. Maybe there are dialect differences. I think mobile is common in England, but cell or cell phone, even any kind of clipping that we see would really give two different forms, cell phone and cell, for the same entity. So the real world referent, there can be a single real world referent and multiple forms that realize that in one form to one meaning. So it's and that's why we talk about it as an ideal. It's not the way language has to be, but it seems to play a role in the way people interpret words. So when you hear a new word for the first time, you think, huh, what does this mean? Is it a word I've heard before? And you try to match it with something. I just heard, in talking with one of you this morning, I ran into a word that I had never encountered before, which I always think is interesting. And this was the word scurf, which have any of you ever run into this word before? Nope. Okay, like me, you didn't know it, so I looked it up. It means a flake of skin, dry skin that peels off of your epidermis, and it's maybe distantly related to the word, or somewhat indirectly related to the word scurvy, which is a disease of the skin and such. Yeah, so this was a new word for me, and I immediately, I'm a linguist, so I think about these things, but even among non-linguists, you think, so how can I make sense of this word? And is it a variant form of a word I already know? Is it an entirely new word, or just what? So this semiotic principle is kind of at work in the way we try to interpret forms that we hear for the first time. And you could imagine what was going on with hen and hemos is basically that kind of puzzlement. So why is it sometimes hen and sometimes hem? And sure, there's a regularity to it, in that the N occurs in word final position and the M occurs in the middle of the word. But does it have to be that way? The answer is no, especially since there are words that have M's in medial position. So there was nothing physiological that was driving that particular development. Okay. So we see this semiotic principle at work, and that gives us some basis for understanding why analogy might actually be a mechanism of language change. So another open question is what determines the linkage? So if part of what's at issue in analogy is a relationship that is perceived between two different forms, even something as simple as the form hen and the form hem that we were just talking about in Greek, or honos and honor in Latin, or even scurf and scurv in if there is a relationship there that we would want to do something with. What is the basis? What determines this linkage? What's the basis for the relationship that's established between forms? Because really, what we're seeing in these analogical developments is that there's a model, and we we reshape a particular word based on that model. You think back to our example of Mendenhall from early on. I think I have it in my here. There was a particular pattern that we extracted, namely name plus hall, like Oxley Hall, Jennings Hall, and so forth. So there was a model, and in the case of analogy, there's typically a model that we can point to as the basis for for driving or pushing one form in the direction of another. That's why I advocate this very general definition: a change in one form induced by another related form. So that entails that there's some relationship established, and that relationship is acted on, that speakers actually do something with it. So in that sense, we're moving out of the realm of physiology, which is what happens with the production of sound and the vocal tract, into the realm of cognition, the cognitive relationship established between different forms, and what speakers do with that cognitive relationship. So what determines the linkage? Okay, there can be a grammatical basis. So that's very obvious in the case of the leveling, where you're dealing with a paradigm telling you really that there are different forms of the same word depending on its grammatical use. So subject case versus accusative case, for instance, or object case, subject versus object, subject versus possessor, that sort of thing. But it can also be the attraction into new grammatical classes, what we could call here form classes, where we have, for instance, in English, a set of past tense forms that are created by vowel change, like hold and held, for instance. And what we find is that within the history of English, a number of words that were at one time were like hold and held, and that they had a past tense form that only depended on a vowel change. So the past tense of climb at one point in the history of English, up until the 19th century even, was clomb. The past tense of help was hope. You can even hear that today in some American dialects. The past tense of yield was yold. But this pattern was a more unusual pattern, whereas the more typical class of past tenses is formed by a dental suffix, like jump, jumped, or walk, walked, or the like. I should put these up here. So like walk, walked, or jam, jammed, or whatever. I'll just say dot, 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 because there are lots and lots and lots of them. They are they represent what we can call the productive way of forming a past tense. So if you have a new verb that enters the language, like not too many years ago, there was a relatively new word like twerk, meaning to dance in a sort of suggestive way, and you could immediately form the past tense of that as twerked with this dental suffix. It's the productive way of forming a past tense, the default, or what we might call the regular type, a different sense of the notion regular, but the regular type. And these so-called irregular verbs, the less productive, the more restricted class, eventually became attracted into the class of the dental suffix past tense forms, so that we now have climbed, helped, yielded, and such, without this vowel change past tense marking anymore. So we see here a kind of leveling in the favor of a productive dominant type. So we could say that there were in English at least two main types of past tense formation, one with the ed suffix, which is realized as d or t or ed, but I'm calling it the same suffix in each case. So that was one large type, in fact, the productive or the default or the regular type in quotes. Whereas the vowel change type of ride and rode, or hold and held, and so forth, was much more prevalent in earlier days of English, but never was it the productive or the default type. For the most part, we may see a couple of exceptions to that. So that what we have then is essentially a kind of leveling out in favor of the productive or dominant type of past tense formation. This is sometimes called external analogy, because the model is external to the lexical item itself. The model is that gives us climb, climbed would be verbs like jam, jammed, or whatever, or the like. So that the dental past tense form represents the model, and the change from clomb to climbed would not be a matter of sound change or anything of that sort, but rather would be assimilating climb into the past tense type of that's productive and dominant, essentially the default. So the model is external to the lexical item itself. With paradigm leveling, we could, by that same kind of terminology, talk about it as an internal analogy, because the model is internal to the lexical item itself. If you think of the lexical item as being a set of that all of these forms would be part of the lexical item, then the change is really an internal change within that lexical item. Whereas with with climb or clomb becoming climbed, or hope becoming helped, we have the model is outside of, therefore external to. Ultimately, I will make the case that these distinctions that we draw between different types of analogy is less important than realizing that what they all have in common. What they all have in common is that there's a relationship established between forms, and a speaker's sort of acting on that relationship, doing something based on that relationship. That's what I mean by saying that the form of one word is changed, induced by the form of a word that's perceived to be related. So external analogy, the model is external to the lexical item itself. Paradigm leveling could be thought of as a kind of internal analogy where the model is internal to the lexical item. External analogy is sometimes called form class analogy, because what we're talking about is whole classes of related forms and what they and how they affect one another. It's also called proportional analogy because it can be modeled as a proportion. So, and therefore this is also referred to as four-part analogy. So we can think of a proportion between a verb like rhyme or jam or whatever. And I'm taking one with a final M in its pronunciation just to emphasize the basis for the relationship. Rhyme forms its past tense, rhymed, with the ed past tense. And we could set that up then as an analogy. Rhyme is to rhymed, as climb is to X. You solve for X and you would get climbed. Whereas rhymed is to climb, clomb is not as satisfying a proportion because the elements aren't balanced in the way that they are after the analogical change takes place. Now we can, just as with paradigm leveling, there was the issue of directionality, which form it wins out, so to speak, in the competition between the different forms. So whether it's hen or hem, whether it's honos or honor, we see the same kind of differential directionality in proportional analogy. So in the case of dive, there are most speakers in at least in the United States have the past tense as dove. So it looks like it's of the same type as like hold, held, or climb, clomb in its older instantiation, or ride, rode, and so forth. But actually, the history of this past tense, and in British English, dived is the more usual. The history of this is actually that the older form is dived, and the dove represents an innovation that took place in American English. Even though if you look at the pattern or the facts with clomb and hope and so forth, it's the vowel change one that's the older form, and the ed form that's the newer one, the innovation. In the case of dive and dived and dive and dove, dived is the older form and dove is the innovation. So we have essentially, in this case, leveling in the opposite direction, giving adding dive to the more irregular pattern, to the less common pattern. Could someone think back just a few minutes to this, what we said about the semiotic principle of one form to one meaning? How would that apply in the case of external analogy, these proportional analogies that we're talking about here? How does climb, climbed compare in that regard to climb, clomb? So climbed, clomb, how does that compare with climb, climbed, in terms of the semiotic principle? And we can add to that, a verb like rhyme. Rhymed, for instance. Can anyone see how the semiotic principle is instantiated here? How it how it plays a role, or how you would argue that it plays a role? Anyone?
You could say the past tense is a form, and so the ed suffix is one form, and then the vowel argination is another form.
Right. So ed versus I'll just say vowel change. And what we have then is really a kind of leveling out of this difference with regard to a particular lexical item. So if you think of ed versus vowel change as being the two forms to one meaning, the one meaning is past, and these are the two forms. So we can add that. So if we do it like this, the meaning is past, and the form that expresses that meaning has two different possibilities, actually many possibilities if we think about all the different vowel change patterns that there are in English. So that putting these together, we can see that it's essentially two forms to one meaning, and therefore the leveling out for this particular lexical item gives us one form to one meaning, namely climb as the only form here, but also ed as the past tense marker is spreading. So it's not quite as straightforward as the paradigm leveling case, but we can invoke the semiotic principle even in these cases of external analogy. We also see this with the voicing that in noun plurals in English. So wife has a plural wives, where the F of the singular is realized as a V in the plural. This is a limited number of nouns that show this, but they're still with us. So for many speakers, the plural of house, this S here is realized as a Z in the plural, houses. But, and this is something that I've witnessed over my lifetime, the number of speakers seem to be increasing, so that increasingly one hears house in the singular, but houses in the plural. I would venture to guess that most of you, my sense is that it's younger speakers who are mainly saying houses with the S in the plural. But my guess is that several of you may be such speakers, and I'm not drawing attention to you in a negative way. I am simply stating a fact here about this. So this would be a kind of, how would this be? How could you motivate this in terms of external analogy? What is the you want to think about what the usual pattern is with so is it, how common is it in terms of the number of nouns that do it, to have this difference in voicing between the singular and the plural, like wife, wives? There are others that do it, of course, as I mentioned, like knife, knives, but is that the usual pattern for all nouns, that you do something to the voicing of the stem in the plural? Can anyone think of cases where that doesn't happen? Like, I don't know, what's the plural of step, for instance? I need a little box. What's the plural of step? Obviously, steps. It's not stebs. That doesn't occur. And this is by far the more usual pattern, that the singular is the stem in the singular and the stem in the plural are the same. The case of wife wives is the unusual case, the what I referred to back here as the unproductive, or the special case, not the default case, or the irregular type, not the regular type. So that what we see here then is a kind of the same kind of semiotic principle as we saw at work as we saw here. We can just say, okay, the meaning is plural and the form is no stem change versus voicing of stem. So we can apply the semiotic principle in the same way, and so that the movement in the direction of house singular, houses plural with an S would fall under this same kind of motivation that we saw for the as involving the semiotic principle. Can anyone make a case for this being a kind of leveling, paradigm leveling? How would you argue that it's paradigm leveling? Or how could you, or could one argue that it's paradigm leveling? And if so, how?
You have two forms for house, one of them not voiced, and then the other one voiced,
Yeah.
Depending on whether plural or not.
Yeah, exactly. So we could look at this and say, okay, houses has two forms, namely a stem in S and a second stem in Z. And that difference gets leveled out. This is one of the reasons why I think that for all the fact that we draw distinctions between different types of analogy, they all boil down to the same kind of motivation in my view. And so whether you think about this as external analogy or an internal analogy, the result is the same in either case, and the motivation is the same in both cases. And interestingly, we find with this particular kind of noun, we find reverse directionality also, so that the word spouse, which was borrowed into English from Latin with an S, has the plural for many speakers is spouses with an S. That's the etymologically expected plural. But there are speakers who say spouses as if it were like houses. So the same kind of reverse analogy that gives dove as the past tense of dive can also be at work here with what we might call the minority pattern. The less prominent, the less prevalent pattern is nonetheless taken as the basis for the innovative change. So, and it's not a matter of right or wrong. Notice that I talked about this in terms of its etymological, its historically attested pronunciation as opposed to the innovative pronunciation. So spouses with the Z shows this innovation of the spreading of the minority pattern. Sometimes now we illustrate these typically with just a single word, but the model is really the pattern, namely the pattern of vowel change in the past tense, the pattern of voicing in the stem versus no stem change versus the ed in the past tense, and so forth. So so in a sense, we could, even though we set it up as a proportion, we could really put in a whole bunch of verbs here, like, what did I have? Jammed, and you could add others to that. And typically we could just do ... to add others. But it's really the pattern of verb to verb with ed, where there's no overt change in the stem of the past tense compared to the oops, shoot, I just lost it all. Oh well. I get a little bit too fancy and I flummox myself, but you get the idea, I trust. So that the model is really a pattern, not an individual word, even though we, for the sake of the proportion, we will sometimes talk about it as if it were just a single item that was relevant. However, sometimes the model really can be just a single word. So in ancient Greek, the word for month was a mes in the nominative case, the subject case, and menos in the genitive case, where there is a difference between the nominative and the genitive. I should have had a hyphen in there. Sorry about that. Where there's a difference then between may as the form in the nominative and main in the as the stem form in the genitive case. What we find in one dialect of Greek is that this historically older pattern changes into a nominative with the form meus with a u in there, meus. Again, that should be that should be with a hyphen like that. And it turns out that there's one noun in the language that has exactly this pattern of a nominative in meu, in eu, and a genitive in ein, like that. And that's the word for the god, the chief god of the Greek pantheon, Zeus, whose nominative form was Zeus and the genitive form was Xenos. This has a complicated history, but this is an established paradigm for this particular noun, and it's the only one like that in all of Greek. But what we find is that Zeus then is the basis for this innovative word for month, the nominative nous. And we can set this up as a proportion where it's not a pattern, but just a single lexical item that is the model. You have then Xenos is to menos. Notice that the genitives are the same except for the initial consonant. And that, so Xenos is to menos as Zeus, the nominative is to X. And if you solve for X, you would come up with mouse like that. And it really is just this one word Zeus that is the model. As I say, it's sort of a singleton. It's a unique paradigm with eu and ein, but it spreads nonetheless into this word for month. Here's another singleton model. So many years ago, when I was teaching about analogy in class, I said, well, we know that I was talking about how we know that what the most prevalent pattern, what the regular pattern is. And I said, for instance, with ride and rode, that we don't find that with the verb arrive. The past tense is arrived. And someone in the back of the room raised his hand and said, well, when I'm from central Pennsylvania, and we would say arove with an O. And I said, oh, really? That was something new to me. If you can check it out on the internet now. This was before the days of Google and so forth, but you can find lots of hits for arove. Now, but what is this innovative form based on? Is there a pattern of some sort that could give you arrive or arove?
Analogy with dive, dove, and
Yeah, it's like dive,
dove.
dove, or drive, drove, even ride, rode. So there's a pattern of verbs with I in the present tense and O in the plural. I'm sorry, in the past tense. So that but probably, I mean, you can even get very specific and say that notice the end part rhyming, the drive, drove, could be the basis for arrive, arove, and you could set it up as a proportional analogy. So it's probably indeed based on drive, drove, or the small class of verbs that are like it. And it even spread. This guy went on to say that in his calculus class, what they did was they derove certain formulas instead of derived formulas, and so it was solidly entrenched for his particular region, at least. But again, we can identify a model, and in this case, maybe not a singleton model, but close to it. But because there are others like dive and dove, which is its own special case in a way, but also ride and rode, this I-O distinction. But in terms of something, if you can get a rhyming form, a rhyming pair that gives you, a really solid basis, and they're both verbs, they're semantically related. You drive somewhere, and after driving, you arrive there. So there's a semantic connection as well as a formal connection there. And it even spread. So, but it's also the case that there can be sort of non-proportional and non-grammatically based analogy. All of the analogies that we've been looking at so far are based on grammar in some sense, like present versus past tense or singular versus plural and such. But there are analogies that are based on a semantic connection. This is sometimes referred to as contamination, which can be thought of maybe as a problematic case, but or a problematic term for some reasons. But it in giving it's sort of suitable here because there really is you'll see a blending of a couple of different words. So the word femelle entered English from French. It refers to someone who is a woman. And it ultimately comes from the Latin word for one who nurses or suckles. So it has to do with breastfeeding and the ability to breastfeed. So femelle from the French, and that was developed in English into female. And it's not a matter of a sound change of L to ale, but rather it seems that there is attraction of, and as I say, a sort of contamination or a blending of the influence of the word male, which is semantically related to femelle. So femelle, male, were sort of blended together to give you female and male, like that. Even though historically they're not related to one another, they have completely different origins. But semantically, they're similar in opposites or in the same class of gender types, for instance. Another example that was like that in Latin, maybe a little less obvious to us though, is the word the Latin word gravis, meaning heavy, with an a here, developed into grevis with an e. And again, it wasn't a matter of a sound change because this a remained in other words, but it was changed in this word. And the usual explanation is that it's by attraction to or contamination from or a blending of, if you want to put it in those terms, the opposite word levis, meaning light. And it isn't always a matter of opposites, but there we see semantically related analogical developments with numbers in sequence. So the Greek word for 7 was hepta, and the word for 8 was was octo. And what we find in some dialects is hepta, 7, and hocto, that is the H of the word for 7, sort of blending with the word for 8, giving you hocto. We also find in some dialects hepta, 7, and octo for 8, with the P of 7 kind of carried over into the word for 8. And this may be at work, or at least partly at work, in the very colloquial and quite common pronunciation of the second month of the year as February, not February, with the R. The R is there in the writing, and some people say it, but February is much more common, and it may be that January is the model, or the attractor, if you will, or the contaminant, if you will. in this case. This leads us into the notion of folk etymology, which is we know by now, we've spent a fair bit of time talking about it in various guises. Etymology is the study of the origin of words and the ways in which the meanings have changed throughout their history. So we can talk about the origin of a word and the historical development of its meaning. We can say things like the etymology of the word devil, for instance. And we know that there's popular interest in etymology. Remember that clip that I showed you from the TV show Blue Bloods, where they were discussing around the dinner table the etymology of the word grifter for someone who is a scam artist. And I think it's just part of natural human curiosity about the world around us. Why is this word? Where does this word come from? Why is this word the way it is? Why does it mean what it means, and so forth? And we see this. We have to bear in mind, though, that not all etymologizing is scientifically accurate. The examples of grifter, you may remember, said, well, it has something to do with graft. And they said, no, it has something to do with, I don't remember right now what the other possibility was, but there was sort of legitimate debate there. Sometimes the etymologizing is just sort of flights of fancy, as it were. So there was an ad on TV last year sometime, I think, where I think it was Flo who does these progressive insurance commercials, and she said, well, what's the deal with this word terry cloth? Who's Terry, after all? And as if it were named for a person, Terry. And actually it comes from a French word tirer, meaning drawn. So it's a type of cloth that is formed in a particular way. And then she went on to say, oh yeah, what about shampoo? It's sham, and oh my God, do we really want to wash our hair with that? But of course, it's not from sham plus poo. It actually comes from the Hindi word champo, meaning press. The early meaning was that of a massage, and the pronunciation that we have, Spanish has champú, for instance, here with a ch, but it entered English from French, and it probably entered French from Spanish, because French would regularly turn a Spanish ch into a sh. So in French, it comes out as shampoing, and that's the basis for our shampoo. But it has nothing to do with sham, false, it has nothing to do with poo. It has an entirely different etymology. So flow was just sort of, as I say, it's kind of flights of fancy. But interestingly, speakers often act as if words should have a sensible composition, as a way of giving words an etymology, trying to understand where they come from. And if, in a case like this, terry cloth or shampoo, she's just speculating about what the origins might be. It doesn't affect the form of the word. It doesn't affect the pronunciation or anything like that. But there are cases, especially with loan words and obsolete words, there are cases where the form of the word is changed based on a sort of an attempt at etymologizing, an attempt at trying to make sense of the word in terms of its origins. So here are some examples from English. The word crayfish, for instance, a small shrimp-like or little tiny lobster-like thing that you can find in fresh water, entered English from French. The French word is crévice, and this vis was interpreted as it had a crévice meant shrimp and another kind of shellfish. And this word was interpreted as if it were composed with the word fish, giving us cray and fish. So here the actual pronunciation of the word was changed based on this apparent attempt at etymologizing. The word belfry for a tower comes from Old French berfri with an R, meaning watchtower, and it was changed in its pronunciation as if it were composed with the word bell, because a watchtower, tall tower, often had a bell in it. Bridegroom in earlier stages of English was bridguma, where the guma was the word for man, related actually to the Latin word that gives us human as a borrowing. And it was remade as if it were composed with the word groom, which would be, guma went out of use as an independent word for man, but groom was still still existing as a like a stable hand, someone who would take care of horses or animals or the like, so that this word was recomposed, or as if it were had a different etymology. So also with shamefaced, comes from earlier English shamefast, where this fast means fixed. So the shame was fixed on you. It's fast as in the sense of to hold fast, but it sounded enough like this fast was somewhat unusual, or had a more restricted distribution in English, and it was reinterpreted as if it were shamefaced, that is, you wear the shame on your face, as it were. So with folk etymology, there's often an element of it sort of makes sense, but it doesn't always have to make sense. So one that where the sense is only approximate is asparagus, giving rise in some dialects of English to sparrowgrass. It's not that sparrows eat asparagus. It's not that asparagus is a grass of any sort, but it's green and it's sort of shaped like a stalk. So, and I guess it's conceivable that a sparrow could nibble on it. But it's trying to make sense of the form and trying to impose a compositionality to the meaning of the word by reshaping it. So we might consider whether how, if at all, the semiotic principle is at work here. Does anyone want to take a stab at that? So by trying to impose an explanation of these words in terms of words that are familiar. So this vis doesn't mean anything, but fish does mean something. The bear doesn't mean anything, but the bell does. The fast had a very restricted distribution in English, but whereas face is a much more common word. So in a sense, what's going on here is that it's working towards the folk etymology is working towards a better fit between form and meaning. So shamefast has this piece, fast, that doesn't really mean anything. So how can we make sense of it? Oh, it's shamefaced. Okay, shame that you wear on your face, that's evident in some respect. Crevis, what's this vis thing? Sounds a little bit like fish. Are we dealing with fish-like entities? Yes, we are. So we can make sense of it and therefore have a better fit between form and meaning by this folk etymological reformation of the word. So it doesn't give us an exact one-to-one matching, but it's moving in the direction of a better fit between form and meaning, and that's really what's at issue here. We can't take the semiotic principle as a hard and fast rule, but we can get a better fit between form and meaning. And we might think that femelle and female really belongs here as a kind of folk etymology, because say, oh, there's this form mel, and I know that this refers to a class of gendered beings, and therefore, since male also refers to that to a class of gendered beings, maybe there's some relationship there. Oh yeah, this is probably female, where there's that male has something to do with a gender category in female. There are also, so these are really a kind of semantic basis for the analogical linkage. There's also a phonic basis that is based on the sound. So the word memento, meaning a keepsake or something that reminds you of something else, is often pronounced momento with an O, and that seems to be based on moment, even though there's not really any semantic connection between memento and moment. There is a bit of a connection maybe between momentous, or we can say that something is of great moment, meaning it's memorable. But it would seem to me that the relationship between the mem of memory and remember and so forth would be stronger in for memento than moment, and yet it's moving in this direction. So that it looks like the sound is the basis for it. It's not a sound change in the technical sense, not a sound change. We can add, now we can add not a sound change proper, now that we have that distinction, because in the same context, we say memory, not momery, pimento, not pomento. Again, I mean, you might think that maybe the labials are driving the E in the direction of the O, but it's not a matter of sound change, because we would expect momery then, and pimento. So it looks like the sound alone is at work here. We see this also in the, we see analogy at work in 3 different pronunciations of the word that's spelled this way. I say it as academia with an E. There's some who say it as academia with an E, and some who say academia with an A. Well, it ultimately comes from Greek academia with a long E. But other borrowings in Greek that had a long E in it, even if they came through Latin, have the long A, I should say, just to try to be, it gets a bit confusing when we use the name of the letter as opposed to the name of the sound. So long A, even though they came in through Latin, they have an E. So the word ethos, for instance. So academia is the oldest pronunciation here. Academia, this middle pronunciation here, we can make sense of as analogical based on the adjective academic with the medial E. So there's the relationship between academia, the noun, and academic, the adjective, gave rise to this analogically based pronunciation, academia, where the noun form is based on the adjective, which is probably a reversal of the usual pattern of what derives from what in this case. Well, what's the source of the academia as an innovative pronunciation? It's an interesting case because there's no obvious model in terms of semantics or form. There's no obvious motive. Some people say, well, maybe it's just a learned pronunciation for something, a learned institution. And that may be, but other words like ethos don't come out as athos, or anemic or anemia doesn't come out as anemia. So there's something more going on here. And as crazy as it seems, and some of you may have even anticipated this, the only basis seems to be the phonic overlap with the word macadamia, which is a kind of nut, which Hawaii is particularly famous for. And there's no, so we can sort of map it out this way, except for the initial M and this and the stressed vowel, they match entirely, a, k, d, m, e, and So macadamia, academia, there's enough of a phonic similarity here that it looks like academia was moved or driven in the direction of macadamia. Now there's no obvious semantic connection here, but I will show you that it's at least in the public consciousness. You're probably wondering about why I didn't show you the t-shirt at the beginning. It's because I was saving it for the end here. I am proud to be an academia nut. There are academia nut in my case. There are people who think that professors are nuts anyway, so it kind of makes sense. In case you're wondering what I'm showing you, it's, if you can't see it, that's my t-shirt of the day, my t-shirt du jour. So and you can puzzle about it and think about it, and there's really, it's not obvious what's going on here, except if you sort of bring in this sort of sound-based parallelism between academia, academia, and macadamia, and there you have it. So it shows us that analogy can be very quirky, which is an interesting outcome. So we can sort of sum up the what we've been talking about last time and this time about these, and we can think of the properties of analogy. Analogy is not phonetically natural or phonetically determined. And remember that we can contrast then analogy with sound change. Sound change we argued very strenuously for is as being phonetically driven, then I talked about, remember, the phoneticity of sound change. With analogy, it doesn't matter at all. The phonetics can play a role. They can drive the analogy, but it isn't the effects of the sounds. It's nothing physiological as it is with sound change. So factors like frequency or grammatical type can matter in analogy. So we can talk about analogies involving past tenses and analogies involving semantics and so forth, which we couldn't do when we were talking about sound change. Analogy is sporadic in its application. So the fact that what we had with the voicing, for instance, of wives is affected house and houses, but mouse has its own plural of mice. It hasn't become mouses or anything, or mouses or anything of that sort. So it's sporadic in application as opposed to regular for sound change. The clomb to climb example has not, and others like it, have not eliminated the vowel change past altogether. We still have like ride, rode, and it can even be mildly, it can spread somewhat, as we saw with the speakers who have arrive, arove, for instance. So analogy is sporadic, whereas in its application, whereas sound change is regular. In terms of motivation, analogy we've talked about as being cognitively motivated. It has to do with establishing a relationship between forms based on their semantics, their grammar, their phonic shape even, but some relationship is established between forms, and that's a cognitive issue. And then speakers act on that. Whereas for sound change, it was physiological in nature. It had to do with the vocal tract and the way in which sounds are articulated. This is sort of related, but in talking about analogy, it's necessarily the case that other forms are involved, because we talk about the relationship between two forms inducing a change in one of them, whereas sound change was simply blind to the particular form. If it really is purely phonetically driven, if sound change is a matter entirely of phoneticity and physiology, then it's blind to the particular forms that are involved, whereas in analogy, there's always going to be the involvement of other forms. So we can see how these properties are realized in our examples so far. The cognitive motivation has to do with the relationship between the singular and the plural, for instance, or between the S or the ED past tense and the vowel change past tense. It's not phonetically natural. That was one of our arguments for in the Greek case, the M to N between vowels, as Jinyi told us correctly, that there's nothing about the vowels that would drive an M in the direction of an N. So it's not phonetically natural. Sporadic in its application, the M to N change occurred just in that word, actually a couple of words that all had the same paradigm shape as the word for one, but the word for, if you remember, the word for garment had the same form, hemos, as the genitive of the word for one, and it was unaffected. So so that we can distinguish between sound change and proper and analogy on the basis of regularity also. And the involvement of other forms will necessarily, that's part of our definition, really. So this is a really key finding that we've come to. And this is one of the reasons why I harped so much on regularity of sound change, because once we establish that for sound change, it gives us a basis for understanding what's going on in other types of changes that we might consider. So I think I'll stop there, because this next point gets us into some stuff that's a little more involved and would take more than the minute or so that we have left. So are there any questions that this raises? I don't see any hands up. Okay. There is, as I say, there is a homework assignment. I think it's homework number 20, and it's due on Wednesday, and we'll go over it briefly in class. It shouldn't take very long for you to do, or particularly if you've been following or listening carefully to this presentation so far. Okay, so I will stop sharing and bid you all. There's one question in chat. Okay, good. You like that. Good. You're supposed to enjoy it. That's part of the. I want you to understand that linguistics can be fun. It's not just dry stuff, but there's a lot about it that's very enticing, I think, and satisfying in many ways. Okay, so I will see you all then on Wednesday. Thank you for a good class. Take care, everyone. I will stop recording.